Welcome to Eyewitness to History. In April 2025, we interviewed Vernon Balderston when he was 86. Born in 1938, Vernon has vivid memories about growing up on a farm in Placerville, California during World War II, his military service in the 1950s, and his career in the United Association of Pipe Fitters and Sprinkler Fitters Union. Vernon, what was it like growing up as a kid during World War II?
The most important thing I remember is we had a Strongberg Carlson radio, and my dad would listen to the news, Edward R. Murrow, giving the report of the war. And we would listen very intently. I remember it well. My uncle, Uncle Babe, was stationed on, wasn't the Arizona, but it was the next battleship that was parked next to the Arizona. And his job was to go ashore that Sunday morning and pick up the laundry for the captains, and we had one admiral on our ship. I mean, they had one admiral on their ship. And so on the way back, the LSD to get out to the ship wasn't there. LSD is a landing craft that takes the, you go from the ship to shore with the LSD. But it's about a 20-foot by 10 feet wide. You've seen them when they invaded Normandy.
Okay.
And they let the big flap down in the front, you walk out.
Yes, okay.
That's LSD. And all of a sudden they look up and here come these airplanes. And he says, what the heck is this? And the Japanese fighters come down and they were bombing in the ships, and he dove underneath the truck and he watched it all happen. He said that haunted him the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm. Early on, you lived on a farm in Georgetown, California. What was produced on the farm?
Well, mainly rabbits. We grew a lot of rabbits and sold them. I'd say 1942, we moved to Placerville, California. My dad went to work in a logging company for Caldor Lumber Company. My dad would work, he ran what was called a jammer back then. Now they've got loaders that load the log, but back then they had a jammer and they had cables go up through a big pulley, and they'd pick up the logs and the logging truck would drive under and they'd load the logging trucks. And for years he loaded trains before the trains were taken out and they started using logging trucks. And I stayed there, went to school there, and I graduated from the 8th grade, and then I've gone to Hayward and working for 3 months so I could buy new clothes for high school. I had a friend that they would come up from Hayward, Ray Hardcastle and Jack Lawhorn. When I was 12 years old, I said, Jack, I'm going to start high school in 3 months. Can I come down to Hayward and work for you? Oh, he says, I mean, work, not for you, but work in Hayward. Oh, kid, at 12 years old, you're not going to find a job down there. And I said, Mr. Lawhorn, I have to ask you a question. Do you have a lawnmower? Yes, I have a lawnmower. I said, I'll make you a deal. I will come down and stay for 3 months with you. I will pay board and room. I will rent the lawnmower. I'll buy the gasoline. And and I will cut lawns. I will make money. I guarantee it. So at 6 o'clock Monday morning, he went to 601 Brandon Street, his office in San Francisco. And at the same time, I took off with a lawnmower and I started knocking on doors. And the first door I came to, the lady answered the door, and I told her my desire to buy new clothes for high school. And she said, how much do you charge, Sonny? And I says, ma'am, I'll mow your grass if you like the job. If you don't like my job, you don't have to pay me a red cent. If you like it, you pay me whatever you want. So at that time, when I was 12, if I got 50 cents or $1 per lawn, I would have been a happy camper. And they would give me a $5 or $10 bill, and I said, I can't make it. Say, no, this is yours. You did a good job, kid. That's yours to keep. The fourth house I came to, there was an old lady, and she said, Sonny, can you plow up my garden in the back? And I said, yes, ma'am, I can. So I took a shovel and I spaded the garden, and I was hoping to get like $10. She gave me $25. And long story short, I worked 7 days a week, 6 o'clock in the morning until dark every single day until the last weekend before high school started. And I told Jack, I said, Jack, I got to go back now. I had my pockets bulging with money. I had hundreds of dollars, and gave my mom and dad money. And I bought all new clothes for high school, new shoes, and I was a happy camper.
What was high school like?
It was very good. I had one of my special teachers was Mr. O'Mara, my social studies teacher. I really liked him, and he liked me. And he ran the wheelbarrow race at the fair and took first place in it. He did. I ran the wheelbarrow race when I was 13 years old, and I came in second out of about 100 people. So I felt pretty good.
What is a wheelbarrow race like?
You have to go through a big hole of water about 6 foot deep, and you have to fill a sack with 90 pounds of ore, put it in your wheelbarrow, and then run the entire race around the whole track. And it's over logs, over rocks, through about a 20-foot canal, about 6 foot deep. And I got all the way in, and I was about 3 feet from the finish line. I was going to be first. And I turned around and looked back, and the guy, I made a mistake doing that, and he passed me up and beat me about a foot. That's how close I come to winning that wheelbarrow race. While I was in high school, at night after high school, I worked at the Tower Fountain in Placerville. My specialty was making milkshakes and banana splits. And then when we closed, I would wash all the windows. I got paid well. And then in the springtime, when they harvested the pears, I worked at the pear packing shed because I made good money there on weekends, Saturday and Sunday. I'll go back to the 1950s. We had an English friend that my mom and dad really liked, and he parked cars at Golden Gate Fields in San Francisco. And once a month, he would take a weekend off, and he had a summer cabin about 5 miles above us. And he would come once a month, and he would bring mom and dad crabs, shrimp, oysters, clams from the Bay Area, and they really liked that. And one day he said, George, my dad's name, he said, you know, I went to the archives in San Francisco, excuse me, and I researched the Balderston name. And he says, I was able to trace it back to the 13th century. And he said, the name started as Boulder's son. And he said, the way that happened, a king had conquered another castle and killed many people. My ancestors were taken as slaves. And when you went to another king, they gave you a new name. And this king had a horse named Boulder. It was a champion racehorse. And that horse sired a colt, and they named that colt Boulder's son. That's how our ancestors got their name, Boulder's son. And then, over the several hundred years later, if you violated any condition of the church, you were banned for life. In order to get back in, you had to change a letter in your name. And that's how it happened. Several times, the Boulder son changed to many, many names. In 1978, the Englishman was well up in his 60 years of age at that time. And I said, Mr. Bomer, would you possibly help us set up a family reunion at the John Scroggins Nugget in Sparks, Nevada? And he said, yeah, I'll help you. And so he did the research, and he sent a notice to all the major newspapers in the entire United States and Canada. And believe it or not, 300 people showed up for that reunion. I was the host. When I told them about how the name started, they were in shock. They had no idea of how far their roots went back. And beyond that, we couldn't trace it because there's no records, no way of knowing what our name was at that time. Fast forward, when I got out of high school, I wanted to join the Navy and see the world. So I was only 17, so my mom and dad had to go to Placerville and the recruiter's office and sign for me. Then I went to Camp Stoneman in San Diego, and served 6 months at training there. When I graduated from Camp Stoneman, they flew me to San Francisco and then bused me to Treasure Island. That's where I joined the ship, USS Jason ARH-1. It was an ocean-going repair ship. We could repair any ship at sea. And not only that, we could distill 250,000 gallons of salt water into fresh water a day. And when we would pull into port, we would sometimes have 6 or 8 destroyers pull on each side of us, and we would fill all their voids with fresh water. We were going up the Yangtze River, and 3 Chinese ships on each side of us followed us up the river. And I don't know how many miles we went, but our Captain Pfeiffer was getting a little nervous, and he announced over the loudspeaker, he said, "We're going to turn around and go back. That's a little bit nerve-wracking," he said. So when we got back into the sea, the Chinese ships backed off, and we made it out okay. But that was a little bit nerve-wracking.
Yeah. Do you know why you guys were going up the Yangtze River?
You know, I have no idea. They were going everywhere. We went to Hong Kong. We went to Midway, Guam, many places in the Far East, and including the Yangtze River.
Yeah, because your ship wasn't necessarily a warship; it was a repair
No,
ship.
we had a machine gun and 5-inch 38 on there, 2 5-inch 38s, and that was it. We couldn't have fought our way out of a wet paper bag.
Okay.
I had my oldest brother was in the Army, and my brother Bob was also in the Army, and he was stationed at Camp Pendleton in San Diego. I mean, near San Diego. And on the way back, he came home on a weekend. And on the way back, he was riding in the center of the vehicle, and the guy driving also was an Army guy, and he crashed underneath the back of it was foggy, and it killed my brother.
Oh.
He killed. And then my brother Ronnie was also in the Army, and my brother Lee and my brother Darrell were also in the Army. They were stationed in Mannheim, Germany, and Metz, France. My job was in the aft engine room mainly. I also worked in the machine shop, but we had about 300 lineal feet of steam-covered piping in the aft engine room, and I worked with Mr. Bankston. He and I were in charge. And if they have a split in the asbestos around the pipe, we would cut a section out and then put new asbestos on that piping. And then our Captain Pfeiffer was very, very meticulous, and he says, "I don't want to find one speck of dirt on top of these pipes." He would take his white handkerchiefs and wipe the top of the pipes, and he better not find a speck of dirt. So we had to scrub and keep them clean every day.
Was that dirt asbestos dust?
Yeah, but they didn't tell us that it was hazardous to our health. Mm-hmm. And so after several months, I started getting sick. And so they said they were going to I'll send you to our hospital in Yokosuka, Japan. So they sent me there and kept me there for 2 weeks. And they never did tell me what the problem was. And they said, "We're going to give you an honorable discharge."
When did you ever learn that asbestos was dangerous?
After I got out, I had a cough, pretty consistent cough, but I didn't realize what it was. And until the Veterans Administration here in Reno, they did extensive tests on me, and they says, "You have COPD, you have emphysema, and you have fibrotic lung disease," which equates to Panameric fibrosis. And he says, "We can't cure it, but we can try to keep it in check." That's why I take those pills every day to keep it in check. And so far I'm okay. I'm doing all right, but hopefully it doesn't get any worse.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your military service.
Sure.
You know, for the life and the impact it had.
So I flew to Travis, got into Treasure Island on Thursday, and the first thing I did is went and bought a new car, or not a new one, but a pretty good car, and got insurance on it. And I had a friend that I told you about earlier that I went and stayed with him for 3 months, mowing lawns and what have you. And he said, "Kid, when you get old enough, I want to get you into the program as an apprentice."
Which program is that?
United Association of Plumbers, Pipe Fitters, and Sprinkler Fitters. And I said, "Well, okay." I said, "When I get out of the Navy, I'll call you, Jack." So that Thursday night, I had a friend that lived in San Pablo next to Richmond, California. And I spent the night with him. And I said, and he worked for Jack Lawhorn. It was also his boss. And I said, "Let's call Jack and see if I can go to work." So we called Jack, and Jack said, "Vern, boy, I'm glad you called, but I hate to tell you this, I don't have an opening right now, but don't you dare forget to call me back because I definitely want to put you on." I said, "Okay." So I called my dad, and Dad said, "Boy, I'm glad you called because Roy Skiles said if I could find a guy for Monday morning and he could go to work." And I said, "You call Roy and tell him I'll be there." So my dad said, "You have to buy a hard hat, leather boots, Levi's, leather gloves." And I said, "Okay." So Monday morning I started to work, and I worked until the snow flew. And it snowed early that year and snowed really hard, about 4 foot deep. And the last 3 logging trucks to get the rest of the logs we had, my dad had to run the grader and pull them up the hill on top of Ice House before they could go down the other side. That was how bad it was. At 10:30 that night, we got into Camino. And the next morning, my car insurance had expired, so I had to go buy new car insurance. And then I called Jack Lawhorn, and I said, "Jack, boy, I'm glad you called." He said, "I can put you to work Monday morning. You meet me at Magic Carpet at 6 a.m. Monday morning on Highway 40. Now, 80 wasn't built yet. So the old Highway 40 went over the top. And he said, "There's a restaurant there called Magic Carpet. And we will have breakfast." I said, "Okay." Well, I showed up at 5 o'clock. I wasn't about to be late. And he got there at 6. And the restaurant was closed. He said, "Boy, I didn't know it was closed. So let's go into Truckee." So we went into Truckee to Brown's Cafe and give him all the paperwork, and we filled it out. And he says, "You're now an apprentice." And so then we went to Squaw Valley Lodge, and the old lodge burnt down, and they were building a new lodge. Alex Cushion was the owner. And he, by the way, he married Nelson Rockefeller's sister, so he had access to a ton of money. And I got along really good with Alex Cushion. He really liked me. And we worked 10 hours a day, 7 days a week until the job was done. And he was so happy. So you guys are way ahead of schedule. I'm very, very happy. And then I left there, went to McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento, worked on an airplane hangar, 120 feet in the air. I wasn't afraid of heights. Well, probably one of the scariest things that I can remember, and I've lost a lot of sleep over it since. And I was doing that airplane hangar at McClellan Air Force Base, working, and we'd climb up scaffolding 90 feet and then scale the steel beams onto the top. And we had a scaffolding that was wide enough to span from one beam to another, and we would slide that scaffolding on top of the beam and then pull the pipe up from the ground and reach down and put the hangers on and make the pipe up. Mm-hmm. One day we had we were hanging 8-inch pipe, scheduled 48-inch pipe, and it was grooved on both ends. And to put a Victaulic coupling, the pipe had to be lined up perfect. So we had one pipe hung, and then set up the cable and pulled up the next pipe, and then they'd have a boatsman's chair, and a guy would ride the boatsman's chair all the way up and put the Victaulic coupling on the pipe. So, and they had 2 rods that were about 10 feet long, 3/4 inch rods with a hanger on the pipe and a C-clamp to put on the beam on the top. So we would take ropes and pull the rope up to keep the rod straight above the pipe. And so we got up and we put the clamps on the beam, and the pipe was about an inch below the other one. So without even thinking, I grabbed my 10-inch pipe wrench, and I got over the beam, and I slid down the 3/4-inch rod onto the pipe. I got the wrench out, and I raised the ring and brought the pipe up so he could put the back on. I scaled back up the pipe, and I didn't think anything of it. And I didn't know that Jack Lawhorn was on the ground watching me. He stayed there till I come down, and he chewed me out like you couldn't imagine. Vern, I never want to see you do that again. And it terrified me then. I couldn't hardly sleep that night.
Thinking, that he chewed you out, or that you were in a very dangerous position?
I was very close to a possible death there. And then one other time, we were doing a job in Arcata, California, and we had a kicker board. There was a catwalk on top, and we had a scaffolding that would put the pipe all the way up. And the last pipe, the one head was not made up proper. It needed to be turned up more straight. So we put a kicker board across the catwalk. I got a couple of pipe wrenches, and my foreman grabbed his arms around the other part of the rail and held the scaffold board down while I walked out about 6 feet, and it's 90 feet to the ground, or the cement. And I got out, and I only had one wrench, I needed 2 wrenches. Without thinking, he just let go of the damn board and reached down and got a wrench, and the board started to fall. I fell back toward the catwalk, and he jumped up and grabbed the kicker board and pulled it out. That was how close to death I came there. And that scared the living daylights out of me. I never will forget that.
Well, I'm very glad to be here talking to you today.
I was lucky. And then we finished that job, and I went to Lancaster, California, on 3 big airplane hangars there at Roddescraft, Lockheed, and North American. I finished those jobs, and then I went to Quincy, California, and he says, I need you there right away. He says, we got a penalty job if we're not done on time. I want you there. And I said, I'll be there tomorrow morning. So I went to Quincy, went to work there. Long story short, I finished my apprenticeship, my 4 years of correspondence at Penn State University. When I graduated, I became a first secretary of treasurer of our local union. It was established in 1915 by General President John Alpine, but he didn't allow for the election of officers. Why, we don't know. For the next 46 consecutive years thereafter, every general president did exactly the same thing. They didn't allow for the election of officers. It remains a mystery to this day. We filed a petition to the United Association, which is the parent association. They had at that time 709 local unions under the auspices of the UA. We were one of the 709. None of them had ever filed an unfair labor practice against the parent organization until we come along. And so we filed a petition in 1962 requesting the right to elect officers. Attention, General President Peter T. Schuman. Our petition came back with a big stamp right across the front, denied. So Bobby Hall and I did the unthinkable. We went to Oakland, California, to the National Labor Relations Board and filed an unfair labor practice against the United Association for violating the Landon-Griffin Act, which Congress passed 4 years earlier in 1959. By the way, the Landon-Griffin Act provided that every local union had the right to elect officers. So the National Labor Relations Board upheld our position and instructed the United Association to allow for the election of officers. So Bobby Hall and I filled out all the paperwork and mailed it in, and there was like a half a dozen other candidates seeking those 2 positions. When they counted the ballots in June 1964, Bobby Hall won president, and I won secretary treasurer. We were so happy. And at any rate, after that, I became a business agent for District 2, which covered the state of California, half of Oregon, the state of Nevada, and at that time, part of Utah, the western part of Utah, and all of Nevada and the Hawaiian Islands. Later on, we hired more agents, and my area shrank. And then I ended up with California from Bakersfield North, half of Oregon, and the northern half of Nevada, from Bishop north. I mean, I was the officer for that area, and I no longer served Utah. When the MGM fire burned in 1986, 86 people died. And shortly thereafter, I went to Carson City and met with Senator Neal and Senator Hernstadt, and I said, I would like to have you introduce legislation to require automatic fire protection sprinkler systems at all new high-rise buildings and timeline retrofit existing buildings. They said, okay. They submitted Senate Bill 214. Lo and behold, it passed. Sent to the governor signed it into law. We had work coming out our ears in the state of Nevada. Several months later, they had a severe fire in the Itakai Hotel in Oahu, Hawaii. 14 people burned to death. So I flew and met with Chair Connie Francis and Co-Chair Welcome Fawcett. I told them the success we had with SB 214 in the state of Nevada. Would they please consider similar legislation for the Hawaiian Islands? And they said yes. They've introduced Hawaii Bill number 86. Lo and behold, it passed. The governor signed it into law. Wow. We had work coming out of our ears in the Hawaiian Islands. When I took over Hawaii, we had 3 contractors and 18 members. Shortly after 86 was signed into law, we ended up with 7 contractors and 200 members working in the Hawaiian Islands. Now I'd like to share a happy experience, which ended up being the happiest working day of my life. And one Sunday evening, my boss, Vern Simpson, called me at 9 o'clock in Sacramento and said, Vern, how you doing? I said, fine, sir. And he said, look, I have a question for you. We have 2 weeks to go before our contract expires. How many contractors do you still have to get signed in District 2? And I said, Mr. Simpson, I've got every contractor signed in District 2. Very good. Look, I got a big job for you. I want you to pack enough clothes to be prepared to be gone for about a month. Darren Gwynn still has 10 contractors that haven't signed, and he's been picketing his largest employer, Harder Mechanical, for more than 2 months. He really needs your help. I said, sir, as soon as we hang up, I'll call Theron and tell him I'll leave Sacramento at 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. That'll put me in Portland about noontime tomorrow. Okay. So we hung up, and before I called Theron, I called a Red Lion Inn because I knew they had a restaurant and made a reservation. Then I called Theron. I said, Theron, I'm going to leave Sacramento at 4 a.m. Maybe we can have lunch at the Red Lion Inn tomorrow at noon. Okay, he said. So at 12:15, he walked into the restaurant and he says, boy, am I glad to see you. He said, I've still got 10 contractors that haven't signed, and I've been picking my largest employer, Harder Mechanical, for more than 2 months now. And he said, look, I'm going to hand you 5 agreements. There's 4 of the contractors are right here in Portland. 1 is in Anchorage, Alaska, Fox Fire Protection. I've been so busy picketing, I haven't had a chance to call him. I said, okay, I'll call him. And he said, tomorrow morning, I want you to set up a picket line at a new furniture manufacturing plant about 35 miles southwest of Portland. I said, okay, I'll drive out there this afternoon and see where I'm going to set up my picket line. So I drove to the job, and it was a little after 3:30 when I arrived, and the job was completely empty. So I figured they'd probably started at 7 and quit at 3:30. So I got out there at 6 o'clock the next morning. The job was dark, 0 traffic. And I sat in the car, parked next to the curb. 20 minutes to 7, the first pickup drove by and drove up to the shack. I figured that was probably the job superintendent. So I got my picket sign out and walked out in the street. And this guy hollered at me. He said, hey, Darren Gwynn's a good friend of mine. And I said, and then he came over and introduced. He said, I'm the carpenter foreman on this job. And I introduced myself and told him I was up here helping Darren walk the picket line. And he said, I see you're picking Harder Mechanical. Yes, sir. He said, I hate to tell you this, but Harder sent all of his men to Crown Columbia yesterday because he's got a $3 million contract there, 3 big boiler rooms, industrial piping, and several fire systems and several new buildings. He's got a heavy penalty per day if he's not kept up to speed. And I said, thank you, sir. And so he went back on the job and went to work. So just to be safe, I stayed there till 8:15, and no one from Harder showed up on the job. So I jumped in the car. I drove to Crown Columbia, which is 45 miles up Highway 16, north of Portland. And as soon as I exited the freeway, I couldn't believe my eyes. There's like 10,000 cars parked there. And another guy pulled off and parked, and I pulled in behind him. I said, excuse me, sir, how many people are working inside Crown Columbia? And he said, there's over 8,000 people working inside Crown Columbia. And the reason I'm not there is because I had a doctor's appointment. All the employees park here and ride buses into their respective stations. And I said, thank you very much, sir, for that information. So I drove back to Portland and told Theron Gwynn, I said, what Harder done? He said, I didn't know Harder had a job at Crown. Yeah, he's got a $3 million contract there. And there's over 8,000 people working inside Crown Columbia. It'd really be great if I could have another guy go with me to help me walk the picket line. And he said, well, I had an apprentice laid off. Let me call him and see if he goes. And the apprentice said yes. So we showed up at Crown Columbia at 6 o'clock that next morning, and we got our picket signs out and started walking. By the way, the ramp came off of the freeway and emptied right into Crown Columbia. And shortly after, here come two big cement trucks exiting the off-ramp. And they were very union. They saw our picket signs. They gave us a high five, turned their trucks around and headed back to Portland. I went, yay. And pretty soon this guy comes screeching his car to a halt, and he says, what the hell are you doing? And I said, sir, Harder Mechanical refuses to bargain in good faith. We're picketing Harder Mechanical, sir. Chuckamaka, Hilo, Sacramento, J jumped in his car and sped off. Pretty soon he came back with a 4x4-foot white sign with a sharpened 2x4 and a sledgehammer. He says, follow me. He's at the edge of the blacktop. He drove that sign into the ground. Gate number 1. This gate is for the exclusive use of Crown Columbia, their employees, and suppliers. Under that, it says, Harder Mechanical employees and suppliers are to use gate number 2. He says, follow me and I'll show you where gate number 2 is. So we jumped in the car, and at the west end of the parking lot, there was heavy timber, drove about 1,000 feet straight up the hill. He went about another quarter of a mile, slammed on his brakes, got another sign out, and drove it in the bank on the right side of the road. There was a narrow dirt road, went down the hill a short distance away. There was a barbed wire fence with a barbed wire gate. And he said, by the way, this road goes about another 3 miles and empties back onto the freeway. And he said, by the way, and he shook his finger at me. He said, you know this is the only gate you can picket. I said, sir, I know the law. He jumped in his car and sped off. The apprentice and I looked around 360 degrees. All you could see was heavy timber and that barbed wire fence below the road. I told the apprentice, I said, you know, it's going to be a cold day in hell before we ever get Harder Mechanical signed at this gate. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave you here, give you some of my business cards. If anybody asks you any questions, you tell them to call me at that number. I'm going to go down and hide my car in that parking lot. I know it's a long shot, but I hope I can catch somebody from Harder going in or out of that gate. So I went down, parked the car, had my Polaroid camera and my binoculars at ready. First hour, FedEx, UPS, lumber trucks, cement trucks coming in and out. Second hour, exact same thing. Third hour, 15 minutes into the third hour, I couldn't believe my eyes. Here comes a green Harder Mechanical pickup. I started taking pictures with my Polaroid. He drove up to the guard shack, stopped. I took pictures. He drove on past the guard shack and all the product. And I went up and got the printers. Hey, we can picket gate number 1 again. So we came back down and picketed gate, and the guy comes screaming, hey, this is illegal. You can't do this. And I said, sir, Harder Mechanical polluted gate number 1, and I've got pictures to show it. I showed him the pictures. He's, mother innuendo, Chuckamaka, Hilo, Sacramento, J. What is your boss's name and phone number? So I gave him Mr. Simpson's phone number, and he went and called him. And he came back and he said, your boss wants you to call him immediately. And under the freeway, there was a restaurant with a phone booth in front. So I went over and called Mr. Simpson. And Mr. Simpson says, Vern, what the hell are you doing? And I said, sir, let me explain. I told him verbatim what happened. He said, by golly, you're doing the right thing. Keep on picketing. Thank you, sir. So I drove back across the street, and the guy was waiting for me. He said, what did your boss say? He says, by golly, you're doing the right thing. Keep it on picketing. dirty, rotten mother innuendo, and he jumped in his car and sped off. Pretty soon he come back and he said, hey, I called Harder and told him, sign your agreement or I'm going to throw his ass off this job. He said, I will sign your agreement, so go give him a call. So my boss, Vernon Simpson, said, before you do anything, you call me first. So I called Simpson and told him what went down verbatim. He says, look, don't sign that SOB. He's jerked us around for more than 2 months now. You tell Harder he's got to fly back here and meet with me personally in Maryland and sign the agreement. And tell such time as he does, you're to keep on picking. Yes, sir. So I went and called Harder Mechanical, and I told him what Mr. Simpson said. Mr. Harder said, well, I'll try to catch the red eye. So the apprentice and I finished the job at Crown Columbia that day, drove back to Portland. We showed up at 6 o'clock the next morning. I told the apprentice, lay your picket sign flat on the ground. I'm going to go over to the phone booth and call it. It's already 9 o'clock in Maryland. So I called Mr. Simpson. He said, hey, you can pull down your picket line. Harder met with me early this morning and signed the agreement. I said, yay. I said, you told Theron? I said, I got a call in there, but he hasn't returned my call. And I said, I know the job he's picking. I'll go back and tell him, okay. So Apprentice and I drove back to Portland. Theron says, what in the heck are you doing here? And I said, Theron, you can pull down your picket sign. Harder signed that agreement. Come on. He said, I've been picking him here for 2 months, and you come up here and one day and you got him signed? I said, yes, I'll explain to you, but Simpson wants you to call him right now, and when you get back, I'll tell you how it happened. So he came back and he was shaking his head. He says, Vern, I don't know how in the hell you did it. And then I told him how it went down. And I said, now, Theron, I want you to draw me a map showing me the location of these 4 contractors here in Portland so I can hit the closest one, the second, third, and fourth in that order. So he drew me a map. We agreed to meet for dinner at 6 o'clock that night at the Red Lion. So we parted ways. I drove to the first contractor, and lo and behold, he was there. And I told him I was up there helping Theron walk the picket line, and we just got Harder Mechanical signed. He said, that's what I've been waiting for. It would not be a level playing field without Harder Mechanical signed. Yes, I'll sign your agreement. Signed it, I shook his hand and left. I drove to the second contractor. Lo and behold, the owner was there. Ditto, shook his hand. I drove to the third contractor. Ditto, I shook his hand. I drove to the fourth contractor. Ditto, I shook his hand. At 6 o'clock that night, Theron walked into the restaurant, and I said, Theron, guess what? I got all 4 contractors signed. He said, guess what? I got all 4 of mine signed too. I said, Theron, I forgot to tell you last night that I called Pox Fire Protection in Anchorage and told him I was up here helping you walk the picket line. And if there's any way you can find it in your heart to sign that agreement and FedEx it back to Maryland, I'll be forever grateful to you. If you insist, however, I'll fly up there and meet with you. No, that won't be necessary. I'll sign it and mail it off today. So I told Theron, let's meet here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I'll call Diane and see if they've received that agreement. So at 6 o'clock that next morning, Diane said, yes, we received that agreement yesterday afternoon. I said, thank you. Can I speak to Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, we've got all 10 contractors signed. Is it okay if I head back south? He said, congratulations. Yes, you can head back south. So I told Theron that Diane received that agreement from Anchorage, and Mr. Simpson said it's okay for me to head back south. So I shook his hand and bid him farewell. As I was driving south, it dawned on me. 2 days' time, I was responsible for getting 6 of the 10 contractors signed, including the biggest fish of them all, Harder Mechanical. It was the happiest day of my entire working life. When I was in the union, I met John Garamendi from California, and he's now a senator. And I knew his wife and his children. I had dinner with him many times. We were very good friends. And of course, I always gave him donations for his campaign, and he appreciated that. And then another person that was very close, and I liked him very well, was Cameron Mitchell. And we got along really well. And another person was Slim Pickens. He would come to the fairgrounds in Placerville, California, and buy some of the livestock at the auction every year at the fairgrounds. And I got to know him really well, and we were really very close. And they'd have a buyer's breakfast the Sunday morning of the auction, and I've sat at his table and talked to him many times. and we got along really well. So I really liked Slim Pickens.
When you're a young kid and listening to the World War II Murrow over your dad's radio, and you told me earlier that radio needed to be connected to his car battery because
Yes.
you guys didn't have electricity in your own house.
Yeah, we didn't have electricity.
And what's the biggest technology change that amazes you today?
Probably satellite technology, the GPS.
Yes.
And you can tap in somebody's address and your car will take you right to that house.
What's your advice for couples about maintaining a good relationship?
Communication and communication and being honest with each other and talking it out. Tuchi and her husband, Jim Lewis, bowled in the lanes right next to our lane. There was 6 teams, and my team, we were on lane 48 and 49. Jim would be on 46 and 47. And so we bowled it. We knew each other very well. One day, the Elks Lodge came up to me, says, "Vern, we would like to have you become an officer in the Elks Lodge." And I said, "Oh, I'm not qualified." "Oh, no, we want you to come in and join." And I said, "Okay." So I joined, and I started out as an inner guard. And then I worked up to chaplain. And then after chaplain, I was esquire. Then I was loyal knight. And then I was leading knight. And then I had the top job as exalted ruler. And Tuchi and her husband both came to my ceremony when I became exalted ruler. When my daughter wanted a garage built in Pleasant Valley, California, I said, "I'll come down and build it." So I built them a 36 by 36 foot garage by myself, did everything, and rolled the trusses, everything. I did it all. So one weekend I went home and there was a call from Doug Tenniger, and he says, "Vern, I just wanted to let you know that Jim just died." I said, "What?" I said, "Which Jim?" And he says, "Jim Lewis." And I said, "Oh my God, when is the funeral?" And he says, "It's already over now." Oh my God. Tell Tuchi I'm sorry, I would have been there. I just want to share one of the happiest days of my life. I went back home again, and Pearl Tenniger called me and says, "Vern, I'd like to come for dinner. Is it okay if I invite Tuchi?" I said, "Sure." So we went to Doug and Pearl's house and had dinner, and we hit it off like magic. And we've been so in love ever since. I love her with all my heart and soul. I wouldn't trade her for any moment on this earth.
Thank you, Vernon. Let's wrap this up with a joke.
3 ghosts in a graveyard, and they were having a conversation about how they died. The oldest gentleman was 98 years old. They said, "Sir, how did you die?" And he said, "By golly, I just died of old age." The second gentleman was 35 years of age. They said, "Sir, how did you die?" He said, "I was in a very serious car accident." The next gentleman was 20 years old, and they said, "How did you die?" He said, "I died of sinus." No, you mean sinus." No, I died of sinus." No, you mean sinus. "Look, I was out with another guy's wife, and he's sinus."